Okay.
Thank you very much, Larry. Our next guest speaker will be, Mr. Damien Onwema. Sorry. I'm not too sure how to say the last name, and I don't want to butcher your name. So Mr. Damien from the African Development Bank Group, also the Chief Agro-Industry Officer. So welcome, Mr. Damien.
Thank you, colleagues. It is a pleasure to come all the way from Africa to this interesting city. Stories are better told when you tell it yourself, and not when somebody is telling the story on your behalf. When Jean came to the bank to market this meeting to the authorities of the bank, we got interested, but with some degree of suspicion. We wanted to actually know whether something is happening on ground, or whether this is one of those conferences that will come and go, and then nothing is taken forward therefrom. So on behalf of the African Development Bank President, Dr. Adesina, we are very delighted to be here. And we want to stay on the sidelines to watch what is going to happen, in the hope that sometime we will enter into the dancing ring. In the African culture, a woman does not enter into the dancing ring just like that. She just goes by the side before she enters into the dancing ring. So we're just by the side before we enter into the dancing ring to make this type of summit something that is worth the while. Secondly, the African Development Bank is the bank that orchestrates the development of Africa. And for us, nothing is more important than the long-term well-being of the food systems of people in our continent. A continent that parades 65% of the arable land in the world. A continent that, in spite of this, imports currently $34.5 billion of food into Africa. And if nothing happens, it's going to increase to $110 billion by 2025. So something is fundamentally wrong with our system. The story I have is not a story of woes, but also a story to tell you that the continent is not stagnant, something is happening, and the bank is orchestrating some development agenda within the continent. Most people have said the potential Africa has, but nobody has eaten potential before. Even if you like, let people say you have too much potential, but that potential will die in you if nothing happens. And that is the case of Africa. Yes, we have too many potentials, but that potential cannot be changed to something constructive without our collective efforts. And I thought that I should mention that when the president of the bank took office, we developed what we call the Feed Africa strategy. And that Feed Africa strategy was contingent upon two things. One, import substitution. Two, export promotion. We thought that majority of the people should be moved up the value chain in terms of providing food for themselves. And by moving away from exporting primary commodities and to develop agro-allied industries, Africa will expand its ability to export processed cocoa, not cocoa beans. Export processed coffee, not coffee beans. Export textiles and not cotton as raw materials. And this is what the bank is aimed at doing. To orchestrate the transformation we have in the continent, When we set out our Feed Africa strategy, we thought that things should be done differently. First, the productivity level of our commodities is the lowest in the world. So what we did was, we have had so many research findings all over the world, all over the continent. We have many CG centers in the continent. But there was a lot of disconnect between research findings and the technologies that is happening at the farmer's field. So what we did first was to call the city centers together, invite all of them and ask them, you have done research for many years, and most of the research findings you have used to gain professors and then gain promotion where you are working, but it has no reality on the farmer's field. We brought all of them together to what we call Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, TAT. Bring them together, bring the farmers together. That thing you have gotten at your lab, the productivity level at 7 tons per hectare, but at the farmer's field it is 1.2 tons per hectare. Transfer it to the farmer's field so that we can increase our productivity. Because without increasing productivity, and they are talking of transforming the agricultural landscape, that is not possible. Even the agro-industry will not take root when the productivity is at its lowest ebb. So that is what the bank first started with, linking research to what is happening at the farmer's field. When we finished with that, we thought that enabling environment is very, very critical. Government has no business in business, and we have to make sure that government doesn't take a lead in agricultural transformation in terms of investments, but that of providing the enabling environment. And we called all the finance ministers of the continent under one room for them to marshal out the way forward for agricultural transformation. And we have had wonderful inputs from the African ministers and presidents of Africa on how to move agriculture forward. Yet, most of them are very rhetorical. In practical and in reality, not much is happening. We therefore involve the African Union to hold governments accountable and to hold them accountable to the budgetary provision they need to make on agriculture each year. And I can tell you that as I'm talking, we have a lot of robust improvement from African presidents in terms of allocation to agriculture. The bank has a couple of flagships, and these flagships are conduit for implementing and orchestrating this transformation. And one of those flagships is what we call post-harvest and agro-processing flagship, where we need to deepen the interaction between production and processing at the end of the day. Why that is happening, we have noted that the post-harvest losses is huge in Africa. And the best way to address post-harvest losses is through agro-industry, not through opening storage facilities, because that is the best opportunity and conduit to absorb what you produce in the field. And to deepen that interaction, the bank has also instituted what it calls a crop processing zone across some areas of high production, so that we can congregate infrastructure within that area to process, to produce, and to market those commodities. We thought that by congregating those resources within that area of high production, that is the best way to make use of available scarce resources that is within the continent. One thing that has also attracted the fancy of the bank, and which we are pioneering, and we have gone a long way in implementing, is what we call enable youth business. If you read some dailies in Africa, they will say youth unemployment a time bomb, youth unemployment a catastrophe in the waiting. So what the bank has done was to have this innovative approach to involving the youth in agribusiness development. And that has attracted the fancy of so many countries in the continent. We have had some young people who even read medicine. They dropped their stethoscope and entered into agro-processing and have made a huge difference in the life of our society. And I think that is the way to go if we want to orchestrate a change in the continent with respect to agro-processing. Much more important is, if you look at the farming population in Africa, they are over 60 years and above. Meanwhile, 65% of the population in the continent are below 35 years of age. And this is the most productive age of the continent. So if we don't find a way to engage them constructively, we are losing that chunk of population to armed robbery, to kidnapping, and to some other social vices, which is now plaguing the continent. We know that productivity cannot happen in isolation. Africa has the least use of fertilizer in the whole world. Indeed, in some climes, there are no fertilizer usages for productivity and for production at the field level. So what the bank has also done was to set up what we call Africa's fertilizer mechanism to orchestrate resources into this input area so that many countries will buy into the idea of establishing many fertilizer companies, because our lands are not increasing. People are farming on the same piece of land year in, year out. And then the productivity level in those lands are going down by each year. So the setting up of this mechanism facilitates the use of fertilizer beyond what people currently do and use. And that is increasing food production in the continent. Remember that when a child is not well fed, it affects the mental development of the child. When a woman is not well fed, the child she's going to bear is going to be affected. So the bank has set up what we call an affirmative action on women in agriculture. And this is a way to drive resources towards women who are involved in agriculture and agribusiness, so that on their own, they can fend for themselves. And remember, when you train a woman, you're almost training society, because she's going to train herself and the children, even her husband. That's not to suggest that you shouldn't train men. We need to train men as well. But we thought that the development impact of training women and engaging them is very widespread if they are very, very well targeted. One thing that has eluded us these past years is what we call the missing middle. The SMEs, they don't have facilities to go to scale. And as coming from African Development Bank, we lend to countries, and our portfolio to countries increased from $2.4 billion to $24 billion in a year. Yet, these loans we are making to countries do not get into the real players in the economy. The SMEs do not benefit from it. So what the bank has done also is to set up what we call Agriculture Fast Track Fund, which is a fund that reaches to the SMEs to enable them come to scale, to enable them come to speed, to enable them become active players in the socio-economic well-being of people in our continent. And I can tell you as I'm talking, so many SMEs have benefited from this fast-track fund, and are making impact on the ground in the continent. And I'm just saying this so that we get to know that the continent is not static. We are making progress. Even though that progress may not be very much widespread, but something is happening in the continent. The topic we've been talking about is digitalization. You can talk about digitalization where you have power, where poverty is not widespread. But if you don't have power and poverty is widespread, technology you are coming up with may not even take root, and then it becomes dead on arrival. So I think what is important and what is critical is that we first of all pass the stage of feeding the population, of making huge production on the ground, before we can get to technology, which is the next phase and next step in terms of agricultural transformation. They are not either or, but we can take all of them, collectively. But what is more important is let us do something that can increase productivity on the ground so that food insecurity, which is breeding violence across the continent, will be a thing of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, we didn't come here just to watch. We came here to see what is happening, how the bank will partner with many of the interests that are gathered in this room. I am saying all this so that you get to know that the bank is trying the best it can to orchestrate that transformation in Africa and to see how together we can move up in the ladder of the value chain so that together we can cause this transformation and agro-industrial revolution to take root in Africa. I enjoy all to perhaps after these opening formalities engage us bilaterally and see how we can work to move the process forward. I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damien. And now we would like to open the floor for any questions for the panel. You'll be second. Go ahead.
I'm Jared McKeown. I publish Black Tie magazine. We're probably one of the best conduits from these conversations to civil society around the world. I just want to ask a question because unfortunately I have to leave shortly. Yesterday, at least I read it yesterday, the Guardian newspaper, which has been actually quite tremendous in covering agriculture and development in Africa specifically. There was an article which is pretty disturbing where it actually documented that fair trade, which is something I'm a great advocate of, has been tremendously unsuccessful in the last couple of years, to the extent that something like only 4% of the fair trade premiums pricing has been attained, and that there seems to be a trend of greening, as they called it, which is companies pretending that they're sustainable and that they're doing good, but just cheapening that definition and lowering the return to the groups, especially the small farmers and co-ops that they're supposed to be supporting. And the other very worrisome thing is the increasing concentration of only a couple of very big buyers in the market dominating and setting the price. Could anybody just speak to that? Because I think it's really a very critical issue when we talk about development and sustainability. Thank you.
Do we get more questions?
Excellent. Thank you. That's a very broad-based question. I think one of the powers that we could see is the work that Damien was already speaking about in the African Development Bank, that the key to this is to actually empower farmers and to invest them into actual value chains in which they have a high degree of control. And actually, it's an interesting issue because, yes, there is concentration, but there is also proliferation in the food sector in a relatively unprecedented way, where we're seeing many of the larger players actually, through digital technologies, find that other people are finding ways to get into the marketplace. And both are really important. We need large-scale players, but we also really profoundly need small and medium-scale players. So to make that concrete, if you look at the ability to get sponsorship that Rami was talking about, digital technology will allow you, for instance, to source farming revenue if you're a young person. And we're seeing this work even in very developed markets, like in Canada, where there's a high barrier to entry because land prices are so excessive that you can actually say, I'm going to grow this product and you're going to take a share in my crop, which is a new kind of sharecropping, but spread out in a digital way, and there's delivery of that garden material. So you can get your vegetables sourced from a farmer that you're actually helping to buy their land. And this isn't just a sort of quaint anecdotal thing. We're seeing that work very well in China, where they've hop-skipped over some of the traditional setups that we've had in other countries that have developed a long middle chain, but they have been able to move to digital sourcing with companies like JD.com, which is a huge company, but their ability to then buy directly from a farmer, create a value chain that's a delivery mechanism straight into a big city like a Nairobi or another country, other countries in Africa where you can go into an urban environment. So I think that there are both of those trends happening at the same time, and that digital technology actually proliferates the ability to create new options for people to grow small businesses and to get into value-added processing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your observation was correct to some extent. The challenge we've had in the continent, and that's why the bank is at the driving corner of what is happening in the continent. When I was making my opening remarks, I did mention that we're looking at a situation where we don't even export cocoa beans, but we process cocoa within the continent. We don't export cotton, but we produce textiles within the continent. We know that there are some standards that are set for farmers that produce in Africa. But at the end of the day, when farmers produce, the standards are adjusted to the extent that what they have produced is no longer as qualitative as it was desired ab initio. And then that dips down the price they give to farmers. And that's a lot of disincentive to farmers who are producing. And those are even making the farmers poorer. And that's why within the continent we are saying agro-industry, agro-processing is the way to go within the continent, so that we produce the food, process the food, so that there's linkage between the farmer and the processor, and that's the value chain, and remove the middleman who is causing this distortion in the value chain. So we believe that by processing the food we produce in the continent, by linking farmers to agro-industries, this type of distortion is completely removed. And this unfair trade of adjusting standards, as it were, will not be there. We have had instances and cases where farmers produce, and then some multinationals come to collect it. They will tell you the quality has gone down. Because the quality has gone down, then the price has completely dipped. And it doesn't make justification for the efforts of the farmer so far. So those are realities, and that can only happen. And we can only reverse that if, as we're all gathered here, we don't even get so much involved in commodity merchandising, but in processing what we produce within Africa. And that's the way to subvert that in the long term. Thank you.
Before we continue with the question session, I would like to introduce Dr. Hamid to take over.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers, youth. It's good to see young people here. Even here at the dais, we have some young people in the back. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here in this hall. And a special thanks to the Ambassador of the Central African Republic to the United Nations for hosting this event. More thanks for Jane Jack for keeping this forum and this conference going on for the last 5 years. As they say, leadership is the wise use of power, and power is the capacity to translate intention into action and sustain it. And he has sustained this conference for the last 5 years. I don't know how, but he did it. So He is a good and true leader. Our last speaker mentioned something about, he said, something is happening in Africa. I just came from Niger. The first week of this month, there was a big event happening actually in Africa. Usually there is 2 times a year a summit for the African Union. And this year the summit was in Niger. And in Niger there was an announcement of something kind of quite big. They put a big ship in the water, these Africans. Do you know what happened there? What was special about African summit this time? They started the African, I can't even pronounce it right, the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is kind of unheard of. They just started this whole process last year. This year, 54 nations out of the 55 nations in Africa have signed. And the only one nation which didn't sign, Eritrea, they're going to sign also. Because the president was there and he said, I just have few things to sort out and I will sign. This is a big thing for Africa. This is bigger ever area, the free trade area in the world in relationship to nations. Something is happening there, very big. Also, I wanted to mention something happened on Saturday, last Saturday. Last Saturday was the 50th anniversary of landing in the moon. Did we go to the moon because we need to solve a problem? No, we went to the moon because we wanted to go. We have the ability and the capability to go. We went to the moon because we worked together. It was a partnership. It was not only America. There were a lot of nations behind the scene working to put a man on the moon. I hope soon they will put a woman also on the moon, or a man and a woman together. So we have the technology now, which 50 years ago we didn't have. We have the technology. There, artificial intelligence, we have the technology, and technology drive development. Are we using the technology we have right? I heard Larry saying that I don't like artificial intelligence. I agree with you if it is used wrong. But what we need to do is need to have leaders in this world, leader of character. That is what we need. We need leaders who could be able to live their life for the sake of others, not for the sake of themselves or their countries or their families. That's what we need. I also, at the first of the month, I was visiting the Pope. I had a meeting with him, and we were talking about peace. What is peace? And as you know, the Pope came here into this institution few years ago. When he came, everybody gathered. Everybody gathered. I never saw something like this. I've been here since 1996. I never saw a gathering of people in this multitude and magnitude. Why? Why people were so interested about it? Because he brings something lacking. Bring the spiritual aspect of the human being. We are not just material. We are spiritual beings. We are not living here forever. We're going to die. What are we doing to this earth? Grabbing things for ourselves? Being rich, many of us, and very few rich and many are poor? One of the best things I have heard in this building is that the SDG, and the idea behind the SDG, to leave no one behind. Enough is enough. Enough is enough to see a baby crying because they don't have food. Enough to see a youth doesn't have education. Enough. We have enough. We have the technology, we have the ability, we have the capability. We need to develop the heart to feel the pain of the other and act out of that heart, not out of this mind and intelligence, just brain. We need to move beyond that. We have enough to feed everybody, educate everybody. Everybody in this world will be happy. Are we doing that, or are we just talking politics? This is crazy. You think there is no money for the SDG to? No, we don't have money. We have money. We have a lot of money. We have more money than we need to make every one of the 17 goals being accomplished. We don't need even the 17 goals. The 17 goals about solving problems. We don't need to solve problems. We need to act out of our heart, out of our awe, out of our creativity and out of our intelligence to serve the others, and we will make miracles. We went to the moon, as I said, not because we want to solve a problem. We went to the moon because we have the ability to do it when we come together. So we need to work together. If we need to walk fast, as they said, you could walk alone. But if you need to walk far, we have to walk together. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dr. Hamid. We are now have an open session for any questions, okay?
Can I address, can I catch you? Can I catch you before you leave, sir? The press man from the UK? So you're talking about the trade agreement and some of the problems that are happening. Understand it's a birthing, brand new birthing. In that process, there will be developments once they understand what the needs are as things develop. The current mechanisms that are in place between traders, brokers, the people that control the industry, when we talk about trade versus local economy type of distribution, the whole infrastructure, even in the U.S., between traders and brokers, they control the industry. Until those systems are addressed to better allow the producers access to markets directly. The UK, in the process of doing the separation, is trying to figure out how they're going to do trade agreements. The US wants to develop more trade. How can an American farmer producing 100,000 bushels of grain be able to supply grain directly to a UK consumer or buyer without having to go through traders, brokers, middlemen? Those things are happening. So in the birthing process, you will see change.
You could,
Yeah, hit the button.
My name's Sparrow, Wilhelmina Sparrow, and I've been an advocate for these very issues, especially here locally. And I believe we're at a time where my brand is about bridging gaps above and beyond, and that's exactly what you're suggesting, is to how do we come together? And like you said, the market is controlled through Wall Street and these industries, which is not a bad thing. We've done a great thing creating an economic system that works. And blockchain also has a great solution to help register these farmers, these female farmers, so that this way their businesses could be protected. I believe it's making it their vested interest, and Canada also has some market in the new growth of medicinal marijuana. So you have these new businesses and grassroots businesses where a lot of politicians are making it, where they're running their campaigns based on these issues now. So they're listening, but how do we implement it where everyone has a vested interest? Because the industries that are in power, it's about legacy. They created this. The threat of the change is not really us prospering. The threat of the change is how do they survive the change so that everyone else can prosper and they don't lose it, and then their children and their families are subjected to the very issues that we're all trying to fight. And those issues are extorting the female farmers and extorting the children. So why doesn't the UN come together in this area to help protect the needs, address the needs, and then the bank could invest in some markets with Canada in regards to the medicinal marijuana. The farmers can come together, maybe farm this product. That will open up a new economic avenue for the farmers to address their needs for the exports, for them relying on the export of the food. And then the other countries that are developing these foods can make money off of it as well. And then America has the tool, Wall Street, to help make these economic developments happen. And then the real estate, last week, a couple of weeks ago at Economists, one of the real estate developers said the biggest issue is bringing in investors to say, hey, it's worth investing in Africa. But how do we do that if the women and children don't have no place to go? And then the wars that had happened, these men and women are extorting the children and the women's because their needs aren't being met. So the UN can interfere because that does violate their right to quality of life for all children. So why don't we just do that where we address the children's needs and the women's needs first, and this allows us to address all these other issues, because you cannot have agricultural development if everyone's under duress, and that's basically what's happening. Everybody is under duress. So where do we change those laws, make it where we can protect that, the mental, emotional, and physical health, as well as the spiritual health, so that everyone can come together and grow?
Perhaps the assignment you are giving to Jane is, where would the outcome of this meeting go? That's what you're invariably saying. Because if the outcome of why we are gathered here does not feed into the general picture, then we have failed. Then we would have wasted resources coming here for nothing. So the question would be, who would be our catchment base for the outcome of what comes out of this workshop? Can we make a declaration after this meeting based on what we are hearing, where we need the, people call it the communique, whatever they call it, but call for action? Who will be our target audience for this call for action, so that whatever comes out of this meeting will feed into this behemoth? Nobody knows where it is. So I think that is what is important. The question goes back to Jane. Who will feed from the outcome of this meeting? Thank you.
Hello? Okay, that's better. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doran Spling, and I'm the executive director as well as a co-founder of a mobile STEM mentoring organization where we travel throughout the United States teaching youth and adults about STEM education. Mr. Rami, I heard you speak about machine learning and AI. That's some of the things that we teach the youth and the kids as well. Mr. Schaefer, I also heard, which I like, that indoor farming idea, which I think is a great idea. But when it comes to educating the youth, what type of commitment, I guess when it comes to funding, resources, are there committed funds to go into townships, to go into villages, to teach or retool or even train these farmers to take on those jobs?
First, thank you for this really very interesting and foundational question, because education is a key factor for the success of this digital transformation. And if we don't feed the information in the right way to the new generation, I think we will fail in to have a sustainable solution. So this is, I think, we have to have this question to the government, to educational sector, to make sure we allocate the right fund in the right way to build a complete education system associated to the market, versus to build a legacy education system that start talking about the previous science and completely different methodology. So I think that focus on the youth and the education is a key success factor to make sure that the solutions and what we do in the agriculture is sustainable. But how to allocate the fund, I think it will be a partnership. We need to engage the community, the education sector, the government, and the private sector. And in Canada, we have a successful story. We are working with different banks. They are working in partnership with colleges, with universities, to see how to engage the new generation in the business, to make sure they are aware and to be able to provide that kind of feedback to the education system and come up with a new model. Thank you.
Thanks. If I may add to that, an excellent question. In fact, I know some scholars who have been working in the agricultural sector to look at STEM as the lens to teach agriculture and agriculture as the lens to teach STEM, because it is, as Larry said, biology, chemistry. It's fundamentally about computer science now. So there's an incredible opportunity to do that, and many women, particularly in Africa, are very involved in agriculture. To take all of the scales, to build on what Rami said, I know of one African fertilizer company, in fact the largest African fertilizer company called OCP, could not find the skills that it needed in engineering, logistics, and AI. So they actually founded a university just outside of Marrakesh to train people to try and get them into their operations, because they are scaling up their project deliveries across Africa. So there's an example of a private sector investment at a very grand scale, and that is financing through the operations of private work. There are also great organizations like the Climate Smart Agriculture Youth Network, 4-H International, that are active on youth training in Africa, who have backgrounds in agriculture and thus are working to train youth, for instance, on climate smart agriculture techniques that address the fact that resilience in agriculture is being compromised due to climate change, and that farmers need new techniques to be able to cope in this reality. So I think that's another great example, and some of those are getting funded through a variety of philanthropic means. Even in my own experience, a group of Canadian, primarily farmers, have worked together in a remote corner of Zambia to support 2 schools that are at an elementary school level, but actually funding the agriculture programs in those schools, because the rural areas are underfunded to have any resource, but those kids are almost inevitably going to grow up to be farmers given the extreme rural nature of the communities. And so we put training for livestock, horticulture, and cropping and gardening into the curriculums there and help them actually grow some of their own food. So you need every scale of this to tackle it, and undoubtedly the bank is doing far more than we could even begin to identify. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add in? The formalized education system has gotten some bad hits of recent with the high debt load that students have to carry with, because of the funding mechanisms that have been in place for so long, and the job availability for students coming out to be able to find jobs in that income bracket, to be able to pay those debts back in an equitable manner. That conversation is happening all over the place. The lack of trade schools, you're still going to need electricians, you're still going to need mechanics, you're still going to need plumbers. The lack of trade schools and the focus on trade schools, I think that is where our push is. I taught the aquaponics certification program for the University of the District of Columbia in D.C. at their farm in Beltsville, Maryland. And when we put out that notice for students, the spectrum of students that we got, the demographics, old and young. And the phrase that some people say, well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sometimes that is true. My dad likes to test the soil by grabbing a chunk of soil, breaking it up, smelling it, looking at it, and that's his analytic process. You take a youth that has no experiential understanding in that, and they have a blank slate. They're a more teachable platform for me that I could take a raw person like that without any prejudgments about anything, pre-understandings, and take a blank slate and let me program him and let me train them. That's the game changer. That levels the playing field for both gender and youth and opens up the door for everybody. You don't have to have any specific skill set coming in the door. So that's it.
In real estate business, if you want to buy a property, they always tell you there are three things you have to worry about, which is location, location, and location. In development, I believe that also, if you want to do a real development of the human beings and of the earth, is education, education, and education. The trick is, what kind of education are we offering to our children? Of course, technical education and intellectual education is important, but goes side with side is an education of the heart, an education of care and love. You said there is money? Yeah, there is money. The philanthropic money in this country is about over $6 trillion. What is being given is $1 trillion only. Why they can't give more? Because we need education. We need education for the people who have the money, and we need education that starts from the family. We need to look at our families. What is happening in our families that our youth are going on the street and being what they are now? We need to look how can we educate our children in the family. In the SDGs, which is a global conversation, we were fighting for a place for the family to be there. We want the family to be there as part of the SDGs. There is some concern there. So the family is the very school where we learn how to relate to each other. Parents and children, brothers and sisters, husband and wife, elder and younger. That is where is lacking, if it is here in America or in other places in the world in different degrees. We need to put money in the family, to educate, to have education in the family first. Because what we do in the family goes out into the community and society and nation and the world. Our families are breaking down. That's the education we need to turn our attention to. Thank you.
All right, so the next question will be by the lady in blue and followed by the gentleman in the back, and yeah.
Okay, just wait. Okay. Thanks, Mr. D. Ms. D. I actually have a question with Mr. Larry, but I I think I'd rather pass it on to the CEO of Trans International because he can describe better of the technology that we have, which I coordinated the, ECOWAS conference last week. So I have the technology that you talk about. It's already ongoing. And I will pass it on to Mr. Tran here, which he can describe to you better. The question is actually, how do we enter, in this sustainable that you talk about? It is because that if we have the technology you need, how do we enter? How do we, sustain the development country? And I will approach this to ECOWAS. That's the reason why I coordinate the conference. It was successful and all this, but I prepared also to help Central Africa. So when I was called to do this, I actually volunteered to help. So let me pass on the questions, what do you call this, the answer to him, because we have the technology to talk about, and I understand all these things, but he can actually, execute this better. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben Tran, CEO of Trans International. We're a private holding companies with stakes in multiple projects in technology, including many of which the panelists have spoke about in IoT and different technology that's going to really help the agricultural industry in Africa. The question that I have is, so if we have many of the solutions that are needed based on what was discussed about, and within our network, we even have investors that are interested in coordinating a strategic coalition to help implement these into the African nations for social impact. What is the next step to go about doing that? Because actually, this question might gear a little bit more towards Mr. Damien, because what he spoke about actually resonated quite a bit with us, because he said that there's a lot of talk about solution, but nothing gets implemented onto the ground. We are private sector, and we are about implementation and how do we get it to work. So in the preliminary discussion with some of the other African nations, we are ready to go. We even invested our own capital to went ahead and do our own feasibility study on African soil, and 60 days later, we show significant result. We're talking about 400 to 600% improvement by implementing a series of many different technologies together into a whole entire ecosystem. However, we do find that the financial aspect and the African segment tends to be a bit of a challenge, because as foreign direct investor, we can only come in with a certain amount of the capital. We cannot come in at 100%. Then that tends to be a bit of a challenge, and also the bureaucracy behind things of getting things through in a speedy manner is also another issue. So I was wondering if Mr. Damien from the African Development Bank can address on how do we solve that particular challenge, so then we all can get this implemented and actually get real solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just some few words. Just like my colleague at the extreme table, we used to say in Nigeria, where I come from, even though I work in Ivory Coast, that the family is as strong as a society. Destroy the family, society is destroyed. Number two is the question you asked. There are two forms of education. Education within the four walls of a school, and education at the technical level. And that's why in our Enable Youth program at the bank, we don't depend on education at the four walls of the university or college. We attach the youth to an agro-industry or to a service provider, so that the youth goes through mentorship, through hands-on experience, before he or she is unleashed into the society. So, and that is the aspect we need to internalize and make sure that the young man, the young woman is well equipped with those technical skills before he or she is launched outside. Now, coming to your question I think I need to make a statement very, very clear. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent of 54 nations with the various agroecological zones, with the various climatic zones. So when people talk about Africa, they talk about Africa as if Africa is a country, as if Africa is just a contiguous place. No, Africa is made up of 54 nations. So it would be nice when people are making an intervention to say, I am doing this in Zambia, in Nigeria, or in Niger, so that you can be better guided. When the word Africa is mentioned, just very bogusly, it creates confusion on us because we don't know what ecological zone you are talking about. So it will be better guided if we know what technology you have, where you have tried it, under what condition you tried it, which country you talked about the intervention you made, so that we can advise you. And then it boils down to what my colleague at the extreme table also, I will take time to know your name after this meeting because you talked what attracted me, is people do small things in different places, then there's no aggregation, and then impact is not there. It boils down to what the young lady who is covering her face with the phone talked about last time. Sorry, I didn't know your name. I have forgotten your name. Yeah. That people are, taking advantage of the youth, the young people. It is when people go into those small pockets of society that people are taking advantage of. But if you are coming to Africa, for instance, and then there's a conduit of entrance through African Development Bank or African Union or other institutions in the continent that is aware of what is happening in the continent, you'll be better guided. And this issue of taking advantage of people will not be there. But it is when people come in with small briefcases of resources and go into those small pockets of societies that those incidences will happen. I think that the ease of doing business in Africa varies from one country to the other. And like I said, Africa is not just a community, it's a continent. If you want to intervene in a particular country, let us know that country. The advantage African Development Bank has is our convening power. The advantage we have is there is no country in Africa we cannot talk to. The advantage we have is that any minister, any president, we can go there and discuss what is coming into that country. So if you have the confidence of the bank, and if you think that we are there to support you, please come along and we'll be better guided on what to do, bearing in mind that you know where you are going, not Africa as a continent. Thank you.
So if I can add to, in dealing with people, because like he was talking about, it's a continent, and even within countries, you have states, and even within states, you have zones, and so it's about relationships, and it's not you can't just step into a community or an environment and saying, I want to negotiate a deal, this is my terms, this is what I want to offer, these are, this is what I want to provide, this is my financing, this is what I want to see out of a return on investment, this is my commitment, that's your commitment, we're going to negotiate. It's more of a social atmosphere, the culture of the people, to sit down with them, spend a couple of days. When you schedule a meeting, you may not have the meeting that day. They may have other business that they may run off to. You may need to stay there several days. And I know you've invested time doing feasibility studies, getting involved and integrating, so you obviously understand that point of it. There's multiple layers. The handshakes that you have to do on the political level, at the federal level, then the state level, then the local level, then there's the tribal leadership that you have to deal with to get them, because there's a level of trust that has to be established. We're not doing business unless I have a good feeling from you, and there's a level of trust that we can engage in doing business. And that's from spending time and having meals together, I get to know your family if necessary. You get to see I expose myself. When I grew up, a handshake was the sealing of the business. We didn't have to sign documents. It was a handshake. And so there's a level of trust that has to be established, and it takes sometimes some time to get to establish that through the relationship that you establish. And understand there's always constant flux. So we talk about the political nature of things. Every country goes through a series of elections, and there's constant transition. And there's constant, to be ahead of those transitions, to constantly be in advance of what's to come, and to do the analytics of the political field of who the potential party person that might be stepping forward in that transition, to try to get in advance of that is sometimes a challenge, because you don't want to offend the people that are currently in charge by supporting an opposition party candidate. And if that opposition party candidate loses, then you've just lost your credibility with the people that are in charge. So there's lots of sensitivities you have to employ when you're entering in those areas. That's just my...
Go ahead.
Yes, my apology for not specifying the country that I was discussing about. We had the way that we approached it originally was we were told that there was a need based on the development program from West Africa with ECOWAS and some of the country from internally. So our approach usually is always coming from a point if there's a need from a specific government, then we are willing to put out the initial capital on our end to do the feasibility and what is needed to provide the particular solutions. And we spend the time and we've done that. It's just the process seems to be a bit slow in terms of what was verbally communicated in terms and for implementation. And we find that the challenge tends to be, part of it is where on the African nation side of having either the land ready or their contribution of the capital so we can come in with the rest. And when it comes down to implementation, the process tends to be a bit slow, than what we found. So I was just asking to see if, from your suggestion, if there's a way that African Development Bank can help facilitate the other end, or if there's another way that that we haven't thought about that we can implement it and move a lot quicker. Thank you.
All right. Our next question will be followed by the gentleman in the burgundy jacket.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Hugues Sannen. I'm the Special Envoy and in charge of international relations to United Nations for the Council for Justice, Equality, and Peace, COGEP International. Our main focus now is to advocate and lobbying for Africa to have a seat at the Security Council here in the United Nations. As we all know, we are about 56 countries in the African continent. We are the second largest and most populous continent in the world. Of course, we all know we have coltan, we have gold, we have mine, we have all type of natural resources and human resources. But instead for us to use big data, because if we have data on education, we'll be able to have a stable education. If we have big data on agriculture, we'll be able to have food for our people. If we have big data on business, we'll be able to have fair trade between or among other nations. But instead for us to use big data, we spend most of our time blaming the white people or the country of our failure. That's why I'm glad to take part at the 5th Agribusiness Conference, and I applaud my friend Jean for putting this together. And then I'm urging all the African people, all the African countries to get together. We need to stop corruption in our country. We need to stop the killing, the fighting among each other, and to try to invest invest among African countries, because if we do not do so, we will not be able to reach to the US, to UK, to other big countries. They will come to our land, they will use us, they will take everything because they see that we are fighting, and they will continue to do interferences. They will invest in our leader, in our government member, to keep fighting so they can keep stealing our resources. So use big data on education, on agriculture, on health, so our people can be well, and then so we can be strong to be ready for 2030 for the 17 goals, sustainable development, because we are big, we are much more, so now we need to be strong in terms of economic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the young lady in the back?
Thank you. My name is Mombi Monene, and thank you. My name is Mombi Monene. I'm from Kenya, which is in East Africa, and I'm pleased to be here. And I just want to first say thank you to the panel for their very insightful discussions. So just going back to the discussion on digital agriculture that we had earlier, I had a question regarding financing this type of movement towards digital agriculture. So in recent discussions at the UN, of course, we have this move towards blended finance and having finance that comes from multiple sources. So from that, my question would be, and this has been touched briefly, is what do we see as a role in terms of moving towards this digital agriculture and digital forms of agriculture? There needs to be, setups such as infrastructure and telecommunications, which is not necessarily there when you think of the furthest behind, and that's, the poorest, most rural people. So in terms of thinking in that way, what do we foresee as a role for the private sector, as well as for the public sector, as well as, for government? So how do we see those roles being taken up in terms of financing to get digital agriculture out to the furthest behind people? Thank you.
Yeah, we can talk bilaterally when the session finishes, my good friend. Thank you. And to my friend also, in my culture, we used to say, when you are pointing at one person, the other fingers are pointing at yourself as well. Yes, we have some internal contradiction within the continent, which we have to blame ourselves for, even though they are orchestrated from outside. But divided we fall, united we stand. If we don't stand within us, you can't blame. Remember, a rat cannot come from outside to come and find where the meat is in the house. It is the rat within the house that will tell the rat coming from outside that this is where the meat is. But that is by the way. Now to your question, my dear lady. I did mention that for any technology to take root, because in September last year, the African Development Bank has had a meeting at Purdue University in Indianapolis, and it was about technology scale-up. There are some essential criteria that are needed on ground before any technology could scale up. One is government enabling role. And I did mention during my little presentation that enabling environment is a critical area the bank is engaging with presidents and ministers of African countries. Because if the ease of doing business is not very friendly, and not much can happen. And if you see most technologies, namely in the US, in Canada, most technologies that have gone to scale, government has a role to support it get to that scale, and which is lacking in the developing world where we come from. So I think more and more, we are making governments to know the role. They are catalysts. There was a statement I made because I wasn't reading what I presented here. There was, we say, however, public sector involvement does not mean strong government intervention, but that it should enable things to happen. If, for instance, in Nigeria, where I come from, fertilizer corruption used to be very, very massive. But government at the time had to come. That government has no hand in getting fertilizer to the farmers, that the private sector should take over. And that was the way that reversal in policy by government was able to remove the corruption in government. So that enabling role of government is very, very critical. But much more important is we have what we call market makers and the private sector now. It is the private sector that takes technologies to scale because they see profit in it, they see business in it. And because they see business in it, because they know they have a lot of clientele base, they can take it up and go to people to make money. Remember, they are not there as philanthropists. They are not there as Father Christmas. They are there to make profit. And what I know and what I have experienced is private sector, individuals are looking for opportunity to make money. So if they see any conduit to make money and it is very veritable, they go to scale. What I have found out in development work also is that the best economists are farmers. Forgive me if we have professors who are economists here, but I can tell you that the best economists are farmers. Farmers know what makes meaning. Farmers know what they will do and make profit. And if they know that, in the project I did when I was with USAID, I was stunned that when farmers knew that when they apply fertilizer, they can have high yield, they even buy fertilizer 2 years in advance so that by the time the cropping year comes, all the fertilizer will not be bought out. But they have, so they are good economists. So when business makes sense, a lot of stakeholders and interests will come and take up that technology. It is only when business does not make sense, it is only when government is trying to push an agenda which is not published in nature that you begin to have those disruptions. But everybody, both government, the private sector, has a role to play. Government, that of enabling environment, the private sector, that of resources to go to scale, and then the market, the population that can take up the technology, and then people make profit out of it. Then everybody is a win-win situation for everybody if things work out well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damien. We are now reached our closing session. We'll be taking a break from 1 to 3 p.m. Everyone will be back. You could come back into the store. You could come back in here at this conference room 3 p.m. Okay?
No, that's it.